What most people don't know about Hospice of Dayton is that it was one of the first hospices formed in the United States. And that was way back in 1978.
Well, we'd heard about hospice, started over in England, and didn't know too much about it really. Betty Schmoll, we met her, of course, and that was an interesting time because Betty was a nurse and she had taken care of her mother before hospice was ever mentioned. And she realized something like that was needed in this town.
So what Betty initiated, what she wanted to do is make sure there wasn't suffering at the end of life. She wanted that support to be there for people who were experiencing pain and suffering and symptoms that were very hard to manage.
She took a concept of reading about hospice, realizing that her own mother did not have hospice care and died in a hospital, and had that foresight, that wisdom to go out, and the strength and energy it must have taken to say, we can do this. To go out and knock on doors, to go to hospital administrators, to lobby, to reach out, to obtain land, and to do fundraising. And what a burden that was to her, to go out and do all that work, to reach out. I think that took a lot for her to do that.
I think it took the fortitude of a couple of people that wanted to start it, like Betty Schmoll, like Carol Dixon, like Jim Ungerleider, to really say, this is something we need, and we're going to be the best at it.
Once I became convinced that we needed to have hospice care in this community, I went around to each CEO of the hospital and talked to them about the hospice concept and what kind of help we would need. We started with money from the hospitals to provide a nurse. We then decided it was time to hire somebody to develop the organization, and that's how we got to Betty. And Betty was a wonderful, wonderful leader and a very capable person who understood what we were trying to do, and it was a partnership. And that inspired her to help develop a programmatic approach to the care of terminally ill patients.
One of the local doctors invited me to a conference they were having locally. And I was sitting in the audience, and one of the speakers was a woman named Betty Schmoll, and she was talking about hospice care. So I was introduced to her after the meeting was over, and we had a nice conversation. Hospice was no building then, it was a half a dozen nurses that were doing some home care. So she knew I just finished my oncology training, and by the way it was in those days, I had a lot of training in symptom management, pain management during my fellowship. So she said, would I like to volunteer to give her nurses lectures in pain management? And within a week or two after meeting her, I started to do that on a voluntary basis, and I enjoyed it, and I stayed connected to hospice ever since then, even as my oncology practice evolved.
In 1979, I was a young oncology nurse at Miami Valley Hospital, and I had signed up for a community project with something called hospice, and at that time I really didn't know. It sort of appealed to me because I was in the field of oncology, and I remember attending a meeting at the Pretzinger House, which is one of the very first sites that hospice would meet. At that point we had about 5 patients, we had 1 nurse, 3 volunteers, and as I remember, about $3,000 in the bank.
Betty picking the right people to start on the board, and our board grew, and by word of mouth they just wanted people that were going to support this, not people just to sit on a board and say, oh, I'm on the board of Hospice of Dayton. These were doers.
I quickly volunteered and went to a meeting at the Pretzinger House over next to Miami Valley Hospital. That was the first meeting place, the first office, and where hospice was really born in that facility. And I went to that meeting and never left.
And our next site was at Emory Park, and I remember those were like real offices. People had offices, there were serious discussions, they were putting policies and procedures into place, and it seemed to have more structure, just something other than just a concept to me.
You know, in 1989, there was a little office right next to the East Town Kroger in Dayton. And just, you know, very simple kind of setting, very informal setting, but also a huge amount of camaraderie. And it was beautiful, and you know, we just thought, I was amazed by how beautiful that building was and how nice it was for our patients.
Back then, we actually had a payroll clerk. We had a closet filled with dressings and supplies that were donated. And you just went in every day and you picked your walker out and wheelchair, you got in your car, and you actually went out and saw patients.
St. Elizabeth Hospital, which is a hospital that closed years ago, they kind of donated 10 inpatient hospice beds to the organization. So now we not only had nurses, but we had a small inpatient facility.
It was serving us fairly well, but was constantly full. As we grew and we took on more complex patients, we identified that some patients really needed more inpatient care. And so Betty went on a campaign to say, you know, I think we need to build our own building.
Before that actually happened, though, she was looking for land to put it on, and the city came up with, they owned this piece of land, and supposedly they offered an extraordinary price for it that we could afford. And I remember we took a little tour before anything was built to see what this place was like. Of course, it was all wooded, but it had 2 nice ponds. It was off to the one side of downtown. So it was just an ideal site. It was like a little paradise we could put hospice into, and it was still surrounded by very nice grounds and a kind of an uplifting atmosphere.
I think that took a lot of courage, and to go out and to get that land, and then also to do fundraising and to have that building paid for by the time we moved in.
It was one of the first in the country, and many of the hospice houses around the country had been modeled after it.
It steamrolled even more because we were kind of surprised in Dayton. We became one of the biggest hospices in the nation.
We early on got our first major contribution for this building from Carol Klein. That was the seed money to start the original building.
We rapidly grew out of the first building.
I bet we hadn't moved in there in 6 months, and we had to grow again. So Betty went on another campaign and had to build the second building.
I was serving as board chair at the time, and Mr. Shaw had come into the building and asked to see Betty, wanting to know a little bit more about hospice. Betty told him the story, and he said, well, I'm going to go home and talk to Mrs. Shaw about this, and I'll get back to you. We're thinking about making a gift, and I just wanted some information beforehand. And Betty said, well, could I ask what maybe you're thinking about doing? And with that, he said, well, $1 million. I don't know if it was the same day or within a couple of days, Mr. Shaw either came back or called Betty and said, I talked to Mrs. Shaw, we've talked this over, and we've decided to make a $2 million donation.
We are where we are today because of those that came before us, that worked so diligently, that took some extraordinary risk and worked very hard to get us to where we are, that we need to be honorable to that each day we need to earn the respect, the trust, and the generosity of this community, that we are now the keepers of the reputation.
I think when you hear the history of Hospice of Dayton, the passion that was put into developing this organization, you can't help but feel pride, even whether if you work there 1 day or 10 days, it doesn't matter. You know you're part of something that's really, really important.
And it is about service. It's about having a servant's heart in doing this work. It's about making sure that we not only provide the very best care, but that people feel good about receiving that care. That the mission's still here, and it's still as important today as it was 35 years ago when Betty started. Now we're building on and innovating in new ways. And ways that we take the legacy of those that have come before us in this mission and build on that. So we want to make sure we honor them. We want to make sure the mission is stronger for it. All the ones who came before, they took those risks, and they deserve the credit.